Frozen wolves scratch at his door. What they want will leave you in tears. The wind screamed through the towering pines, rattling the wooden walls of the small cabin like an unseen force trying to claw its way inside. Snow had swallowed the world outside, covering the ground in a thick, merciless blanket, erasing all traces of the trails that led to civilization. The sky, once filled with stars, was now nothing more than a swirling mass of darkness and ice. Inside the cabin, Daniel sat in front of the fire, his fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The dim glow of the flames flickered against the walls, casting restless shadows that danced across the room. It had been 3 days since the storm trapped him here, cutting him off from everything and everyone. No phone signal, no roads, no way out. He was used to solitude. It was one of the reasons he had chosen this isolated retreat in the first place. But tonight, something felt different. It wasn't just the storm. The air carried an unease, an unshakable sense that something wasn't right. The wind howled, but beneath it, there was something else. A tension, a presence he couldn't explain. The kind of feeling that sent an instinctual chill down his spine. He glanced at the old wooden clock hanging on the wall. 12:07 a.m. The night stretched endlessly, the storm showing no sign of slowing. He let out a slow breath, shaking off the creeping sense of unease. He was overthinking things. The storm was playing tricks on his mind. Then it happened. A sound. Faint. Almost too soft to notice at first. But it was there. Daniel's body tensed. He held his breath, listening. At first, he thought it was a tree branch scraping against the cabin. But the sound came again, deliberate. Slow. Close. His fingers tightened around the mug, the heat suddenly forgotten. Then, through the wailing of the wind, another sound followed. A low whimper. His pulse quickened. He set the mug down carefully, his ears straining to make sense of what he just heard. Was that an animal? Out here? In this blizzard? It didn't make sense. No living creature should be out in this storm, not unless it had no choice. Another sound. A heavy thump against the door. Daniel shot up from his chair. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something or someone was out there, and it wasn't just passing through. The whimpering turned desperate. The scratching grew frantic. Whatever was outside wasn't trying to get away. It was trying to get in. His mind raced through the possibilities. A lost dog? A coyote? Or worse, something waiting for him to open the door? The wilderness had its share of predators, and in a storm like this, hunger could drive anything to desperation. But then, something in the sound made his stomach twist. It wasn't just an animal noise. It carried something deeper, something raw fear. Daniel hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to stay inside, to let the storm take whatever was out there. But the sound wouldn't let him ignore it. It gripped his chest like a vice, demanding him to act. His hand hovered over the doorknob. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. With a slow, shaking breath, he turned the handle. The door creaked as it opened. A gust of icy wind slammed into him, stealing his breath away. Snow swirled in thick, blinding sheets. But through the chaos, his eyes locked onto the figures in front of him. And then his breath caught. His blood turned to ice. Because standing there, half buried in snow, were wolves. Frozen, trembling, staring straight at him. And what they were protecting sent a chill through his body unlike anything the storm ever could. The icy wind hit Daniel like a slap, sharp and unforgiving, nearly knocking the breath from his lungs as he pulled the door open. Snow swirled wildly, rushing inside in chaotic flurries, and for a moment, his vision blurred with white. But then, through the storm, he saw them. Wolves. 3 of them. Their fur was matted with frost, their bodies barely visible against the thick snow piling around them. Their breaths came in heavy, labored puffs, vanishing into the frozen air. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. Wolves were supposed to avoid humans, not approach them. Especially not like this, so close, so still, so desperate. His first instinct was to take a step back, to slam the door shut before they lunged. But they didn't move. No snarling, no flashing of teeth, no aggressive posturing. They weren't hunting. They were waiting. A shiver ran down his spine, though he wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the sheer strangeness of the moment. He had encountered wolves before in the wild, always from a distance. They were supposed to be cautious, territorial. But these wolves weren't acting like predators. Then, he noticed something even stranger. Something that sent a jolt through his chest. They weren't standing tall. They were crouched low, heads lowered, eyes pleading. They weren't trying to intimidate him. They were begging. Daniel's breath hitched. He had seen wolves in survival documentaries, had read enough about their behavior to know that what was happening now was beyond unnatural. Wolves feared humans. They stayed away, knowing that humans were more dangerous than any storm. But these wolves, they weren't just lingering. They needed him. One of them, a large silver-gray wolf with piercing blue eyes, lifted its head slightly and let out a sound that sent chills through Daniel's body. A whimper. It wasn't the growl of a predator. It wasn't the warning of an animal preparing to attack. It was a plea. Daniel felt frozen, not from the cold, but from the sheer impossibility of what he was witnessing. His mind screamed at him that this was a bad idea, that he should close the door and walk away. But his gut told him otherwise. These creatures were on the brink of collapse. Their fur was coated in ice. Their bodies trembled violently from exhaustion. And yet, even as they stood there, desperate, they didn't make a move toward him. They weren't here for food. They weren't here to hunt. Then he saw it. Nestled in the snow between them, hidden beneath their protective bodies, was something small, something fragile, something barely moving. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he stepped forward, his heart pounding wildly. What were they protecting? And why had they come to him for help? Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, his breath curling into the cold night air, his mind racing between instinct and reason. Every part of his survival instinct screamed at him, "This is dangerous, close the door, don't get involved." These were wild predators, creatures of the untamed wilderness, creatures that didn't belong anywhere near humans. Letting them in was madness. And yet, his eyes flicked between the three wolves, their bodies shaking from exhaustion, their fur dusted with ice. Despite their strength and power, they looked weak, desperate. Their once proud stance had been replaced by something that disturbed him more than aggression ever could. Submission. They weren't here to fight. They weren't here to harm. They were here to beg. But it wasn't just the wolves that sent a jolt of unease through his chest. It was what they were guarding. In the middle of the huddled pack, buried in the snow, lay a small, frail shape. A pup? No, it was something else. Daniel's breath caught as he focused on the fragile form. A child. For a second, his brain refused to process it. He blinked against the storm, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. But there was no mistaking it. A tiny body, wrapped in tattered fabric, barely visible against the snow. A child. A human child. The world seemed to stop. The storm howled around him. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but he barely noticed. His heart pounded against his ribs as his mind scrambled for an explanation. How was there a child out here in the middle of nowhere in this blizzard? Where had they come from? How had they survived this long? And the most terrifying question of all, why were these wolves protecting them? His fingers clenched around the edge of the doorframe. The logical part of his brain screamed that this could be a trap. A sick trick of nature. Maybe the child was already dead, and the wolves were keeping him as food, luring him out into the storm. Maybe the second he stepped forward, their behavior would change, and they'd turn on him in an instant. But deep down, in the part of him that wasn't ruled by fear, Daniel knew that wasn't the truth. Because these wolves weren't acting like hunters. They were acting like guardians. One of them, a large silver-gray wolf, lifted its head and met his gaze. Those piercing blue eyes held no malice, no threat, only urgency, only pleading. And in that moment, Daniel realized the truth. These wolves weren't asking for shelter for themselves. They were begging him to save the child. Daniel's body moved before his mind could catch up. He grabbed his thick winter coat from the hook near the door and yanked it on. His boots crunched against the snow as he stepped outside, the freezing wind slicing into his skin. The wolves didn't move. They stayed perfectly still, watching him, waiting, not attacking, not growling. He took slow, careful steps toward the bundle in the snow. His breath came in ragged puffs, every nerve in his body on high alert. The closer he got, the more his stomach twisted. The child wasn't moving. His pulse hammered as he crouched down, his hands shaking as he reached out. Carefully, he pulled the fabric back, revealing a tiny, pale face. The child, a boy no older than 5 or 6, was limp, his lips tinted blue from the cold. Snowflakes clung to his dark eyelashes, unmoving. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He pressed 2 fingers against the child's neck. A pulse, faint, weak, but there. Adrenaline surged through him. He didn't have time to think. Without hesitation, he scooped the child into his arms. His body was ice cold, his tiny frame barely registering any weight. The wolves stirred at the movement, their ears twitching, their eyes following his every move. But still, they didn't attack. They just watched. Daniel turned back toward the cabin, cradling the child against his chest, shielding him from the wind. As he reached the doorstep, he hesitated for just a moment. He looked back at the wolves. Their job was done. They had brought the child to him. Now they just stood there, their breaths heavy, their bodies shaking. He expected them to retreat, to disappear into the storm. But they didn't move. They just waited. Daniel swallowed hard. He knew the choice he was making was insane, but he had already made it. With one last glance at the wolves, he pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside. The warmth of the cabin hit him immediately, but there was no time to waste. He rushed to the fireplace, grabbing a thick blanket and wrapping it around the boy, his hands working fast, rubbing the child's arms, trying to bring warmth back into his frozen limbs. Then, before his mind could catch up with his actions, he turned back to the open door. The wolves were still there, still waiting. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He had already taken one risk, but something deep inside told him that this wasn't over. He took a shaky breath, then stepped aside, leaving the door open, and one by one the wolves walked inside. As Daniel shut the cabin door behind the wolves, the weight of his decision sank in. What had he just done? He had willingly let 3 wild predators into his home, something no rational person would ever do. But these wolves weren't acting like ordinary wild animals. They didn't lunge. They didn't growl. They didn't even explore the cabin. Instead, they circled the child, sniffing at him gently, their bodies tense with concern rather than aggression. Daniel swallowed hard, watching the scene unfold. He wrapped another thick blanket around the boy, rubbing his arms to generate warmth. His skin was ice-cold, his breathing shallow. The child was barely hanging on. His mind swarmed with questions. Where had this child come from? Had he been lost in the storm? Was he abandoned? Kidnapped? And why, of all things, were these wolves protecting him? He needed answers. Daniel grabbed a lantern and moved toward the wolves, keeping his movements slow, deliberate. The largest wolf, the silver-gray one with piercing blue eyes, lifted its head. It wasn't afraid. It wasn't hostile. It was waiting. And then Daniel saw it. His breath caught in his throat. A mark, a faint, jagged scar, running across the wolf's left ear. His stomach twisted. No, couldn't be. He stumbled back, memories rushing to the surface. That scar, that unmistakable marking. It was familiar. Too familiar. He had seen it before. Years ago. On a wolf he had once saved. A wolf he had once raised. "Shadow," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The wolf blinked, its ears perking up at the name. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. This wasn't just any wolf. This was his wolf. The one he had rescued as a pup nearly 7 years ago. The one he had nursed back to health after finding it wounded in a hunting trap. The one that had disappeared into the wilderness when it was old enough to survive on its own. The one he thought he would never see again. Shadow had returned. And he hadn't come alone. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat as Shadow took a step closer. His blue eyes locked onto him with a familiar, knowing gaze. This wasn't a coincidence. This was fate. His mind reeled as realization struck him. Shadow had brought the child here, not by accident but on purpose. The other wolves weren't just any random pack. They were his pack. The storm outside howled, but inside, Daniel's world had shifted into silence. He looked down at the boy, still wrapped in blankets, his tiny body barely moving. He needed help immediately, but there was something Daniel had to understand first. His eyes flicked back to Shadow, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "Who is this child?" As if answering, Shadow let out a low, quiet whimper. And then he stepped aside. Daniel's stomach lurched. Something was lying in the corner. Something he hadn't noticed before. A tattered, soaking wet backpack. Heart hammering, Daniel crouched down and grabbed it. He unzipped it with trembling fingers, rifling through its contents. Children's clothes, a small water bottle, a toy car, and then a piece of paper, a letter. Daniel's hands shook as he unfolded it. The ink was smudged, but the words sent a chill down his spine. "If you find this child, please protect him. He has nowhere else to go." A deep sense of dread crept over him. This wasn't just a lost child. Someone had left him out here on purpose. But why? And how had Shadow found him? Daniel looked up at the wolves, at his wolves, and he knew they had saved this boy, not just tonight, but long before they had reached his doorstep. This child had been with them for days, maybe longer. The wolves hadn't been hunting him. They had been keeping him alive. But the biggest question still remained. Who had abandoned him? And why? Daniel glanced down at the child, at his fragile body, his tiny fingers twitching slightly in his sleep. Whoever had done this had wanted him gone. And if they had gone through the trouble of leaving him out in the middle of a deadly storm, it meant they didn't want him to be found. Daniel's mind raced. The boy's shallow breaths, the eerie stillness in his limbs. He was fading fast. Hypothermia was tightening its grip, and if Daniel didn't act now, the child wouldn't make it through the night. He grabbed his first aid kit from the shelf, hands shaking as he pulled out a thermal blanket. Peeling away the boy's wet clothes, he wrapped the thin frame in layer after layer of warmth, his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. "Stay with me, kid," he muttered under his breath, rubbing the child's arms, trying to generate heat. He needed to get his body temperature up, but blankets alone wouldn't be enough. Glancing around the room, his eyes landed on the fireplace, its flames flickering weakly. Not enough heat. He needed to do more. His gaze shifted to the wolves. They were watching him, watching the child. Shadow, the massive leader of the pack, stood the closest, his piercing blue eyes filled with something unspoken. They knew. As if sensing the urgency, the wolves began to move. Without hesitation, Shadow stepped forward, lowering his massive body beside the child, his thick fur pressing against the boy's frame. The others followed, curling up around him, creating a cocoon of warmth. Daniel sucked in a breath. They weren't just animals. They were guardians, protectors. For the first time that night, Daniel felt something shift inside him. This boy had a chance. But they weren't safe yet. As Daniel was about to exhale in relief, a sound from outside made his blood run cold. A sharp, distant howl. Not from Shadow's pack. Something else was out there. Daniel froze, his instincts on high alert. Was it another wolf pack? Predator? Or someone looking for the boy? Shadow's ears twitched. The other wolves stirred, their bodies tensing, their hackles rising. They sensed danger. Daniel grabbed his rifle, his eyes darting to the window. The storm had begun to ease, revealing the dark, desolate forest beyond. For a long moment, nothing moved. And then footsteps. Not animal. Human. Daniel's grip on the rifle tightened. Who else was out here in the middle of the storm? And were they friend or foe? Shadow let out a low, warning growl. Whatever was coming, it wasn't good. And Daniel knew one thing for sure. Whoever had left this child to die had just realized he was still alive. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as he gripped the rifle tighter. The wolves were tense, their eyes locked on the door, muscles coiled like springs. Who was out there? The sharp crunch of footsteps in the snow sent a shiver down his spine. Someone or something was getting closer. His breath hitched as he peeked through the window. The storm had calmed just enough for the moon to cast eerie shadows over the snow-covered trees. Nothing. No movement. But he could feel it. Someone was out there. Watching. Waiting. He turned back to the child. The boy's breathing was still faint, but the wolf's warmth had helped. He wasn't out of danger yet, but he was alive, and someone had tried to make sure he wouldn't be. Daniel's eyes flicked to the soaked backpack beside the fireplace. The letter. If you find this child, please protect him. Who had written it? He dug through the bag again, searching for any clue, any name, any piece of information that could explain why this boy had been left to freeze in the middle of nowhere. Then he found it. Stuffed inside the side pocket, barely legible from the water damage, was a train ticket stub. The destination? A town nearly 50 miles away. Daniel's stomach twisted. Someone had taken this boy far from home and abandoned him in the middle of a deadly blizzard. This wasn't an accident, and the realization made his blood run cold. Whoever had done this wanted the boy gone. A deep growl rumbled from Shadow's throat, snapping Daniel out of his thoughts. The footsteps outside were getting louder, closer. Then a voice, faint, muffled by the wind. A man's voice calling out a name. Daniel's heart lurched as he turned to the boy. Was it his name? The child stirred slightly, his face scrunching up in a weak, pained expression. His lips moved, but no words came out. Who was he? And why was someone looking for him now, after leaving him to die? Daniel's instincts screamed at him. This wasn't right. If the person outside had been searching for the boy all along, why hadn't they called for help? Why hadn't they checked the nearby towns? And why did they wait until the storm had passed? Because they didn't want to find him alive. Daniel stepped toward the door, the rifle firm in his hands. This wasn't just about rescuing a child anymore. This was about stopping whoever had tried to kill him. The storm had passed. The world outside Daniel's cabin was now covered in a thick, glistening blanket of snow, untouched except for the deep paw prints leading to his door. The night that had begun with an eerie knock, frozen wolves begging for help, and the discovery of a half-conscious boy was now ending in a way he never could have imagined. The child, who had clung so desperately to life, was stable now, bundled up in warm blankets, his color returning. He was weak but breathing steadily, saved not only by Daniel but by the very creatures most would have feared. Daniel looked at the wolves that had stood by him through the night. Shadow, the massive pack leader, sat near the door, his piercing blue eyes locked onto Daniel's. It was as if he knew what was coming, that their time together was over. The other wolves stood close, their bodies relaxed but their instincts sharp. They had done what they came to do. The boy had survived. Their mission, whatever had driven them to that door in the dead of night, was complete. Daniel swallowed hard. He had always lived by one rule in these mountains: never interfere with nature. But tonight had shattered that belief. He stepped forward, crouching down to meet Shadow at eye level. "I don't know why you did this," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion, "but I owe you more than I can ever repay." Shadow's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and for the first time, Daniel saw something deeper in the wolf's eyes, an understanding. Slowly, the great wolf rose to his feet. He turned toward the door, giving one last look at the boy, then back at Daniel. A silent farewell. One by one, the wolves followed. They moved like ghosts across the snow, blending into the endless white. Within moments, they were gone, disappearing into the vast wilderness they had always belonged to. Daniel exhaled, his chest tight. It was strange. Just hours ago, the sight of a wolf pack at his door had sent a jolt of fear through him. Now, watching them leave, he felt something else entirely. Gratitude, respect, even loss. As dawn broke over the mountains, Daniel stood outside his cabin, staring at the fading tracks in the snow. The boy still slept soundly inside, safe for now. everything had changed. For years, he had seen wolves as nothing more than predators, dangerous, unpredictable beasts that should be kept at a distance. But last night had rewritten everything he thought he knew. They hadn't been killers. They had been protectors, guardians. They hadn't begged for shelter for themselves. They had done it for the child. Daniel had always believed that nature was something separate from himself, something wild and untouchable. But now he saw the truth. He was part of it. The wolves, the storm, the child, they were all connected in a way he had never understood before. A sudden rustling in the trees made him turn his head. For a moment, he thought he saw something. A shadow between the trees, a pair of glowing blue eyes watching him. But in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Daniel smiled. He knew he would never see Shadow again. But he would never forget him. As he stepped back inside, he glanced at the sleeping child and made a silent promise. He had spent his life avoiding people, avoiding attachments. But now, maybe it was time to change. As Daniel sat by the fire, watching over the sleeping child, he reflected on everything that had happened. Just hours ago, he had been alone, living a quiet life in the wilderness, avoiding the world. But fate had other plans. The wolves had defied every expectation. They had shown him something far greater than mere survival instincts. They had shown compassion, intelligence, and loyalty. They hadn't begged for shelter for themselves, but for an innocent life that had been abandoned. They had risked everything, trusting a human to help. And in return, Daniel had learned something he never thought possible, that the gap between man and beast was not as wide as he once believed. For centuries, humans had feared wolves, hunted them, and pushed them away. But here, in the depths of a deadly storm, they had been the ones to show true humanity. Daniel knew he would never look at the wilderness the same way again. The bond between humans and animals wasn't just about domestication or ownership. It was about respect, understanding, and trust. It was about recognizing that every creature had a role in this world and that sometimes, even the fiercest predators could be the greatest protectors. The child had survived not because of luck, but because of an unspoken alliance between man and nature. And that was something Daniel would never forget. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Daniel knew that this night had changed him forever. He had spent years living in isolation, believing that nature was something to be kept at a distance. But now he understood. Nature wasn't just something to be feared. It was something to be embraced, protected, and learned from. The wolves had taught him that. And now, as he looked down at the sleeping child, safe, warm, alive, he felt a responsibility to do more than just survive in these mountains. He had to protect them, protect the wolves, protect the land, protect the delicate balance that had existed long before humans ever stepped foot here. Daniel stood up, his gaze drifting toward the tree line where the wolves had disappeared. Somewhere out there, Shadow and his pack had returned to the wild, carrying with them the same silent wisdom they had always possessed. He whispered a quiet, "Thank you." This wasn't just his story. It was a reminder to the world. A reminder that nature isn't just a force to be controlled or conquered. It is a force to be respected. And if we take the time to truly understand it, we might just realize that the creatures we fear the most are sometimes the ones who save us. This incredible story is a reminder that nature is full of mysteries, and sometimes the most unexpected connections can change everything. Wolves, often seen as dangerous predators, showed the deepest form of compassion that night. They proved that the bond between humans and animals is stronger than we realize. If this story moved you, take a moment to appreciate the wildlife around you. Support organizations that protect endangered species, speak up for animal welfare, and learn more about the incredible intelligence and loyalty of creatures like wolves. Most importantly, share this story with others. Let people know that sometimes the ones we fear the most are the ones we need to understand. What do you think about this extraordinary connection between man and nature? Have you ever witnessed an animal do something incredible? Share your thoughts in the comments below.